hot topic. The FAFSA is going to see a big change. So this is a perfect timing to kind of answer some of those questions and go over some of those changes in today's session. So here's kind of the lineup or the outline, which I'm going through fairly quickly because I want to leave lots of time for Q&A. We'll do some brief introductions here at the beginning. We'll talk a little bit about a timeline update with the FAFSA. I have a couple questions that I'll kind of start with to start today's session with, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A from you. The group will answer as many questions in the time frame that we have, and then Mark has curated and I've curated some tools and resources that might be helpful to you as these updates and as the FAFSA becomes released. So yep, there is a Nearpod, and here you go. I'll keep repeating it in the Zoom chat. All righty. So the expert, today's session, the person who's going to address and answer a lot of our questions is Mark Salisbury. He's a familiar face here at NGPF. Mark, go ahead. I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Hey, this is really fun, Amanda, and it's really cool to see names I actually recognize who've done the series that I've been doing for the last several years. So thanks everybody for joining me. Yes, it's true. I am Mark Salisbury, and I've spent my whole career with sort of one foot in higher education and the other foot on the other side of the river, which is everybody who's going through that process of trying to figure out, how do I make the right choices? How do I pick the right schools? How do I pay for this? How do I find the schools that fit my budget? My PhD is in this stuff. I'm terrible at parties because all I talk about is higher education stuff. But the last several years, I've run the TuitionFit project, which, as many of you already know, is essentially from the ground up. We're crowdsourcing the actual prices that students get asked to pay from colleges all over the country and building a data set so that folks can figure out which schools fit my budget and not get into the situation that everybody ends up in these days where I got accepted, great, can't possibly afford it, what am I going to do?
Awesome. So happy you're here, Mark. And this is, like I said, perfect timing with our FAFSA conversation. So start with this, if you will. It's December 5th. FAFSA typically releases October 1st. We're seeing a delay in the release. So as of today, December 5th, what can you give us an update on the release timeline, and somewhat briefly, how is that going to impact other deadlines in this whole financial aid process?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is the topic of some very nerdy betting pools in offices around the higher education landscape. It's been really a guessing game. About June, it was, the Department of Education said, well, it's not going to be October 1st. We're shooting for December 1st. And then it was November 27th. They put out a big release that said, it'll be by December 31st, which sort of means tongue in cheek. The FAFSA is coming out December 25th, maybe, or December 32nd, maybe. And that's where we're at. We're all just on pins and needles. What we do know also is that all of the back end stuff with the FAFSA that's supposed to be done too won't be done even by then. So we all think about it as families filling out the FAFSA, right? And it going to the federal government. What we don't tend to think about as much is all that data then getting sent out to colleges all over the country, right? Because that's where it ultimately ends up. And the Department of Education also announced at the end of November that that isn't going to happen until at least February. So all of that information that the colleges need to make choices, make decisions, they're not going to see it for a whole nother month after December 32nd when it comes out, right? So that's the situation that we really are in. And lots of folks are already asking the question, why? Why is this? So we should tackle the first question, or the second half of the first question you asked me, which was, what's the impact on all of the other deadlines out there, right? Well, that's been a real mess. And the impact has been sort of everybody catches, catch can. So as folks know, or should know, the Pell Grant's the primary reason why we have the FAFSA. And the federal government's policy is, as long as you fill out the FAFSA by June 30th, if you qualify, you get the money. So the government doesn't know how much Pell Grant money they're going to give out year to year. Some years they give out more, some years they give out less, but it's always there. It's just about the deadline. But there's a whole bunch of state programs where the state budgeting says we have X number of dollars assigned for our state need-based grant. And we also use the FAFSA to determine if you qualify for that or not. Well, so many of those states have deadlines now that are earlier than June 30th because they know they're going to run out of money. So for example, in Texas, January 15th, that's not good. In Texas, what has happened is a whole bunch of schools have said, well, okay, we're going to push it back to March and work with the state to push it back to March. But a whole bunch of other schools said, no, it's staying January 15th. So it really is a toss-up here as to how these things are going to play out, because different organizations have played it differently. And I think that when you zoom out just a little bit more, it makes sense, right? No state's budgeting cycle is going to change just because the FAFSA was late, right? Their fiscal year is going to still go to the fiscal year end of June, whatever it is. They're not going to be moved by some little folks at the Department of Education saying, but the FAFSA. So this thing has really now caused all kinds of headaches, and colleges still want decisions by May 1st because they still have a whole series of steps that have to be taken on their campuses. How many students are going to be in which residence hall? Depends on how many freshmen we've got. So how many students are going to be where, and where are all of those things have to get sorted out in terms of all the things you can imagine, right? How many classes in the English Composition 101 do we have? How many sections do we have to offer next fall? All that stuff has to get figured out, and that takes a period of time. So we're looking at a real crunch over the next several months, and how it's going to play out, well, the only answer is it's going to play out. How? Hang on.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Definitely going to be interesting, especially impacting all of those other timelines. So again, I have just a few questions, kind of getting some main questions out, setting kind of the scene before we invite you to ask some questions. But to my knowledge, it's been about 40 years since the last big FAFSA update. Right. So what's the general purpose or reasoning behind these big changes that they're making?
So when the FAFSA was first developed, and it was even way back when, it was just called the Financial Aid Form. Really boring title, right? And it was only to identify students who qualified for a Pell Grant. That was it. At some point in there, somebody said, well, we should come up with a name for the number that comes out of the FAFSA, right? That end of the formula number. And somebody said, well, let's call it the expected family contribution, because that's kind of what we think it is for the families that are Pell Grant eligible or ballpark Pell Grant eligible. Okay, fine, no problem. Move on to the next thing. Over time, what's happened is the FAFSA has the higher ed industry, not just the folks at the Department of Education, but the higher ed industry sort of compelled the FAFSA to start to serve two masters. One was the Pell Grant eligible students, but the other was, we're going to use this term, expected family contribution, to say that that number actually is what the family should expect to pay, what a college should expect a family should be able to pay for college. Now, the goofy part of that is that nobody ever designed that formula to be valid across the entire economic spectrum. They only designed it to try to identify who might qualify for a Pell Grant. And you can see how this plays out in the last couple of decades. More and more families get an EFC and say, that's bananas. There's no way we have that money sitting around. And it's especially true when EFC never included accounting for cost of living. So your EFC in the Bay Area, I'm sorry, your EFC, same EFC in Davenport, Iowa, completely different context, not accounted for at all. Over time, that really created a lot of problems. And so this move is basically a return to the beginning, return back to our core goal with the FAFSA, which is let's make sure that all of the individuals that need Pell Grant money should get it. So they've expanded the number of students that are going to qualify for a Pell Grant. They've changed a number of different rules to say, if your income is X, I don't care what your assets are, you're going to get at least a minimum Pell. And the formula has been changed to really expand and more clearly say, this is for identifying people who should get a Pell Grant. The downside of that was all those other folks, essentially what the new formulation of the FAFSA says, we don't care. You're on your own. So we're going to call that outcome the Student Aid Index. We're changing the name, but now it's not attached to any sort of on-the-ground tangible meaning. It's an index in the most traditional sense of what an index is, right? And an index is really just understood by the numbers are understood in their comparison to other numbers, right? So your number on that index is higher than somebody else's number on that index. That means that you're higher. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to play out for financial aid offices because those folks still think in terms of the outcome of the FAFSA as the EFC. That's the way they've been thinking for years. So this shift is going to really prove interesting, especially over this year. But the whole purpose of this move was make the FAFSA way shorter because it just kind of added questions over the years, make it way shorter and refocus it on the folks that need the Pell Grant and get out of the business of trying to say the outcome of the FAFSA is somehow demonstrative of what a family could actually pay for college.
So you've hit on a couple, there's lots of details obviously to this, and we're going to get into some of those details, but you've hit on a couple key changes in your just answer that the redesigned FAFSA. So it's the 24-25 FAFSA, which is going to be released here in December, just kind of clarifying that for anybody new to the financial aid process. But there's lots of changes to this redesigned FAFSA. The EFC is going to now be called the Student Aid Index. We're expanding Pell Grant eligibility. But if you had to narrow down like all these changes to maybe like the three most important or key or big, if you will, changes to this 24-25 FAFSA, what would you say they are?
Number one is the expanded access to the Pell Grant money. More people are, especially on the end of this Pell Grant spectrum, we're qualifying for a minimum Pell. Far more people are going to qualify for that than used to. It's $740, so it's not a ton of money, but it's not nothing. That's books for a year, right? So a lot more people are going to qualify for that. And that was thing one. But the other two things that I think have really shook people is, I guess number two would be this move away from the EFC as a reflection of what a family could pay for that student to go to college. When you remove that construct, that sets a couple of other things in motion. And one of the ones that was a big one and a big shock to people was the old formula included considering how many students a family had going to college at the same time. So the idea was you got this family unit and you're sending multiple kids to college. So the EFC for that particular student is shaped by if they've got a sibling in college right now, right? When you pull away from that and you start shaping it around the student and the student's aid index, now all of a sudden you don't need that number in the formula anymore. But that's a big shift for people because there was an awful lot of folks that mostly wrongly, but still passionately felt like this was some sort of great, wonderful sibling discount. And one of the things that shaped this thinking was just the reality that most of the people filling out FAFSAs aren't 17-year-olds in traditional family settings. The 25-year-old single folks, 29-year-old married person, independent, going back to school, trying to get more education. So when you realize that the FAFSA's got to address and be accessible conceptually to everybody who needs to use it, it made sense to sort of zoom away from something that sort of privileged the idea of a student being the norm coming from a traditional family thing. But that EFC change, not the language change, the student aid index, but the elimination of this sort of pretend sibling discount, that got all kinds of people up in arms. Number three, and this is actually much more impactful for most Americans, or middle America in particular. In the old FAFSA, if you ran a small business or if you owned a farm, those assets that were a part of that small business or part of that farm were not a part of the FAFSA calculation. Totally not a part of it, right? Now it is. And that's one that's got a lot more people squawking. A lot of folks here are from states where they've got a lot of farmers, and a lot of farmers, they might have $1 million in assets, most of it's land, but it's not assets like a stock portfolio. It's a completely different thing, right? But right now it's sort of all in this muddy mess, and there's a legislation sitting somewhere in the congressional pipeline, sausage machine, that proposes to rescind the rescinding and make small business and farm again be something that you eliminate from the calculation. But that's something that has changed an awful lot of folks' access to some Pell Grant money and access to some state level money, because that's been a really substantial change to that formula.
Great. So I covered a little bit on timeline and general purpose of changes, and there's some questions coming up in the chat already, and also some of the key kind of changes that we're going to see to the FAFSA. So now we want to open it up to some of your questions. So hopefully you have joined me on Nearpod, and if not, there's the link again in the Zoom chat. And so here's how we're thinking we're going to do this for some participant Q&A is I am right now going to go ahead and put a collab board up on Nearpod, and should be loading here in just a second. And I any questions kind of that you have related to FAFSA changes or related to the FAFSA that's coming out here in December, go ahead and post them on that collab board. We'll give it just a minute. You can also upvote if you want by just clicking that little heart. That will put some of those questions near the top. And then we're going to answer as many of them as we have time for, but then also share some resources with you here at the very end of the session. So pause for a moment, and you can, there's one already that looks like, I don't know if you can see it, Mark, but I can also be relaying some of the questions to you.
Yeah, fire away. I'm seeing.
Okay, seeing a few. So I'm pausing for just a moment to allow questions to populate a bit. Again, you can, if you have similar question, you don't have to post it multiple times. You can just click that little like, and then I can resort a bit here based on that, so we can address the most common questions. Let me just do it on my end here. There we go. It should reshuffle it a little bit here. Okay, so I'm going to let that populate. Mark, you're welcome to ignore it, and I can kind of filter through and ask some, because we have time here. About a half hour of our session is dedicated to answering questions. So one common question is, what happens if you can't get a parent to fill out the tax information on the FAFSA? Good question.
So this is where they really did some very smart things to the FAFSA. It used to be that the presumption going in was your parents are there. You're trying to get away from or avoid having us have the information of where you really have some money with mom and dad. Now they flipped it. So in the process of filling out the FAFSA, one of the first set of questions is, do you meet any of these categories where you might not have communication with parents, or you're in the system, foster care system, or homeless, or any of those kinds of things. But what can happen if you can't get a parent to put their information in, you can still, as a student, complete the FAFSA, and the information will go to the college and say that the student is provisionally independent or provisionally completing without parent information. And then the school's financial aid office can help that student sort of work their way through whatever the problem is, and help to use what they call it on the college level, professional judgment and special circumstances to address some of that stuff. There certainly are cases where, parents just say, I'm not paying for anything for you to go to college. Okay, fine. But then the parent also says, and I'm not filling out the FAFSA. And that can actually really hurt the student, because the student in the old days would really be in a bind there. And the process wouldn't even let them proceed to the end of completing the FAFSA. So now the student can actually get to the end of the FAFSA, complete it, get it sent to the schools, and then work with the school to sort out whatever the issue is.
Yeah, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't they using a new term this year? I think they're calling it a contributor this year as part of FAFSA. Yeah.
Yes. So this is another really big conceptual change, but it's a conceptual change that's much better for all of the individuals that fill out a FAFSA every year. So the student starts by creating their FSA ID, and then the student understands, or somebody has helped that student understand, that there might be individuals whose tax returns and other financial situation impacts that individual. Let's say that you and I are a couple, and you're going to school, and so you would list me as your spouse as a contributor, right? Because we share incomes and we have a house together, right? Same thing then so now the student, who is the 17-year-old who lives at home, says, okay, it's my parent or parents that are bringing in the money that pays for me to do everything that I'm doing as a dependent. So then I can pick them as the contributor. And now we have the same term for anybody. So the idea here was to make this, again, something that fits for everybody. But then the student identifies the contributor or contributors, and I'll explain exactly what that means in a second. And then that contributor gets an invitation to create their own FSA ID, and then can contribute to that student's FAFSA. Now, when I said contributors, what I mean is this. If you've got a married parents are married, but they're filing taxes separately, then the student would need 2 contributors. Otherwise, if it's the parents and they're filing taxes jointly, then you just need 1 contributor. And the question that lots of people ask is, but if you're divorced or separated families, in that case, it's 1 contributor, not both. This is the difference between the CSS profile, that other one, and the FAFSA, where on the FAFSA, if your parents are divorced or legally separated, then you only need 1 parent to be the contributor. And this is where there's another little change. It used to be that the contributor, or the parent in the old version, was who the student spent the most time with over the past 12 months. Now it's whichever parent provides the most financial support over the past 12 months. Now, originally, folks got really stressed about what that means. So folks have dug into it a little bit. the Department of Education has not been great in providing any kind of detail about how that gets assessed. And frankly, my guess is that it's not going to be a rabbit hole they're going to dive down, because that would be really a mess to figure out. But essentially, it's this: tell the students and parents of divorced and legally separated parents, think broadly. So yes, you might have some child support. Yes, you and your ex might switch off year after year in declaring the student a dependent for tax purposes, and that might be part of the divorce agreement. Forget about all that. Just think broadly. So there might be some child support coming in, but if one parent's also still paying for rent and also still paying for food and insurance and gas money and everything else, add that stuff up. And if you can reasonably justify that you're even close, then stick with the parent that is the one you have a better relationship with anyway, because that's going to make it easier to get the FAFSA done.
Great. Sorry, I'm scanning questions. There's lots of great questions
I'm
here on
watching
this.
your eyes just like go
You're
flying
watching
all
my
over the
eyes go
screen.
around
Yeah.
a little bit. Yeah, I'm sorry that. So question, although some people are answering even the questions on the collab board here. Can you circle back to a little bit on the FSA ID?
Yes.
Can students and parents create their FSA ID now, or do they need to wait until the new FAFSA is released?
No, the FSA ID can be done now. The Department of Education and a number of others are, advocating, get that done, at least get that done, at least get in the system. And folks can do that now. Absolutely can do that now.
Excellent. So another question that's kind of popular in here is, what investments are not included in the FAFSA calculation?
So the two big sets of investments / assets, and I think you kind of have to say it that way because they all sort of sit in the same bucket. The one of them is your primary residence. The house if you own a house, you don't count that in your FAFSA reporting. Again, the CSS profile asks about your primary residence, but the FAFSA does not. The other big section of that is traditional retirement holdings. So 401k, IRA, Roth IRA, pension, that stuff doesn't count. In terms of investments, you're asked to provide a number, add up all of your assets, right? And the Department of Education doesn't, on the FAFSA, they don't ask you to submit documentation. You're just supposed to add it all up. And folks need to remember that, and this is something somebody will probably ask about, but it used to be you had to fill out all of this stuff manually from your taxes. And then there was this, you could link it to your tax returns, but you didn't have to. The new FAFSA automatically links to tax returns. And the Department of Education's been a little clumsy in their language here. They've said, you have to consent to linking to your tax returns. But if you don't consent, you don't actually fill out the FAFSA. So it's kind of automatic. You're sort of forced to. But there will be all kinds of situations where that linking won't work, because maybe somebody's remarried since the tax return that would be used for the FAFSA, right? But to the point about investments, on the tax return, remember that there's reflection of income made from assets, right? So folks who want to say, well, I won't quite count everything and I'll just stick the number in that's a lowball number, there's a shadow on the taxes of the kind of income you might be making off of dividends and tax returns and capital gains and everything, or not tax returns, investments and capital gains and everything else. So there's really not an investment that is something that you can just sort of like, you have to count your 3M stock, but not your Apple stock. It doesn't work that way, right? You have to count all of that stuff. But retirement, don't count it. And primary residence doesn't get counted.
Perfect. So I'm going to circle back to a couple questions and something that you said. So you mentioned that they have to provide consent on the new 24-25 FAFSA. somebody put this in the chat, so I'm just kind of grabbing it as they, because it clicks with what you just said.
Yeah.
If they don't provide consent, then they won't be eligible for federal student aid. Is that true, or is that correct?
They won't be able to complete the FAFSA if they don't consent to have their tax return linked and get the data from the tax return.
Perfect. So there's a question about the student aid index. So kind of circling back to that index, what exactly that number translates into. So is a high number high need? Like what is the meaning or yep, go ahead.
Essentially what the SAI, the student aid index, is intending to convey is the relative financial affluence of that student. So a high number means you are better off financially than a low number. That's really all it means at this point. And this is a really big switch because we've got it in our head for so long that the outcome of the FAFSA is somehow supposed to say, yeah, that's the amount of money that you ought to be able to have, you ought to have for your kids to go to college. And if you don't, somehow you're a bad parent. Now they're trying to pull that apart, but it's going to be difficult because that's sort of what we have in here. It's kind of, I mean, to be fair and honest, it's kind of a flimsy thing. It's an index, but it's an index only in the sense that, yeah, the bigger number means you got more money than the lower number, but it doesn't really apply. It doesn't really necessarily say that money is enough to pay for this actual dollar amount. It just says, yeah, they've got more than somebody else.
So the next questions, and I actually haven't seen much about this, but I think the SAR, the student aid report, is getting a new name. You can imagine that, but have you seen anything about that? The question is, does the student aid report look the same as past years? Is that going to see any changes?
So I don't know because we haven't seen one yet, right? I don't know of any conversation of a massive change in the student aid report. So I suspect it will look quite similar to what it did before, with instead of EFC saying student aid index.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything related to that either, except for are they renaming it like a FAFSA submission? I thought there was a new name for it, but I could be wrong. As is the student aid.
I've seen a few different names thrown around, but until I know for certain.
Yes.
I'm
right.
sticking with SAR. I've got enough changes in acronyms. My brain hurts.
Exactly. Do you know, there's two questions related to if there will be a like a practice, like a link to practice filling out the FAFSA or a new demo FAFSA on the web so they can get an idea of what the new application looks like before guiding students through.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's, we'll talk about this a little bit later in some of the resources, but the Department of Education has produced a prototype that you can go to, click on, open it up, and pretend to fill out a FAFSA. Now, not all of the links work in the way that they will in the final version. They don't necessarily, if you put in a number that doesn't make sense, it's not necessarily going to flag it like it used to. But there's a prototype that you can use for different basic types of students, right? An independent student, a dependent student with one parent, a dependent student with two parents. You can go and test that prototype out just to get a ballpark sense. There's no guarantee that that prototype is exactly how the new FAFSA is going to play out, but it's certainly better than nothing. And that's linked, we'll show people later, but it's on the studentaid.gov, the FAFSA, and it's also the FAFSA site there on the Department of Education site. You'll also be able to find it on the NCAN, the National College Attainment Network's Better FAFSA site. That's been really the best place to go for just an aggregation of all the different tools and webinars and toolkits that people have produced at different organizations.
Yeah, we're going to wrap up, like before we wrap up today's session, we have a couple resources that we'll share with you as Mark mentioned, and then we'll also follow up with some resources in like the follow-up email that might be helpful to you, although people are dropping links in the chat that might be helpful too. They're finding them maybe.
Yeah, that's great.
Fine. There are a couple questions, and maybe feel free if you're seeing some of the questions, if you see
Yeah.
one that you want to address, but a little bit about dependency status and is there an age? Oh, I lost the question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think I know, I think I remember seeing it.
Okay, how
So
old a
correct me if
student
I'm
has
wrong,
to
but
be
first
classified
of
as?
all, the FAFSA starts with the presumption that a student age 24 or younger is going to be a dependent. That's the assumption they start with. In the old FAFSA, they didn't just start with it as an assumption. They started it with a "I dare you to prove me wrong" kind of mindset. They have shifted that a bit. They've loosened that a bit, but they're still going to start with that assumption. So any student that's under 24 that's going to claim that they're independent, they're going to have to demonstrate somehow that they really are independent. A student can't just say at 19, "Oh, I'm an independent," while they're living in the basement at their parents' house, right? And they've never completed their own tax return. They don't even have their own bank account, all that stuff, right? You can't just, it's independent and dependent are still sort of governed by this basic presumption of 24 and younger. But the new FAFSA makes it a lot easier for a student to say, yeah, you know what, my situation's complicated. And then to communicate that through the early part of the FAFSA, get a provisional status, and then, as we mentioned before, get the school to be the ones to have to drill down and figure out, okay, what exactly is going on here, and do we need to use our professional judgment, freedom, degrees of freedom to identify that, yes, this student's 20, but yes, they're absolutely independent. And, you know, take a homeless student who's been homeless since they're 16 and they've overcome incredible odds, and they kind of know where one parent is, but they don't know where the other one is. You know, the old system made it really hard for that student to get through the FAFSA and just get a result because they had to prove all this stuff, right? The new FAFSA has done a much better job of sort of opening that space up a little bit. But that core presumption about independent and dependent status still stands.
I think you kind of answered. I'm just going to, because there's a question and it's been kind of up towards the top. A lot of people asked it of parents that are legally separated or divorced, but have been living apart for a long period of time.
Parents who are or are not, but have been living apart.
When parents are not legally separated or divorced, but they've been living apart for over 3 years is what the question says.
Right. That gets to be a sticky part because in the old FAFSA, they kind of let you say if your parents are separated, you could just say they're separated. But now they've really doubled down on if you're not legally separated, you're just living apart, then you're going, and if they're living apart, they're probably both filing taxes separately. Then you still need to get both contributors, both parents to be contributors on that FAFSA. Again, if the situation really is more complicated and the student really isn't connected to one of the two parents, or there's some other issues there, sometimes it's just purely for the safety of the student. There's some really, awful things going on. That's where there's room to articulate that, get through in a provisional way, and then let the school sort out and get some clarity. But that's a great question because that is not an uncommon issue.
All right, I feel like this is a good question. So what are some of the biggest mistakes people tend to make when they're filling out the FAFSA?
A couple of them are, well, let's start with one. The biggest one is, and it's not even when they're filling the FAFSA, it's that they don't fill it out until they miss a bunch of state deadlines, thinking that the state deadlines and the federal deadline line up. So they'll wait until June to fill it out, And then because of that, they miss out on a bunch of state aid. But getting to more specifically the question of when they're filling it out, what mistakes do they make? Way too often, when the parents are filling out the information about themselves and they're totaling their assets, they will include their retirement. It happens all the time. They'll add up their, maybe they're a teacher and they've got a TIA CREF fund that's, a 401k, but they know that number. They'll go, oh, that's an asset. And then they'll add it in there. And that number is over the moon, way more than it should be. Another mistake that they make is the parents will include the student's assets when they report for the parent. So maybe the grandparents have in their will left for the student some stock portfolio of some sort, and then they left some stock portfolio for mom and dad. Well, the parents are sort of familiar with that, and they sort of think it's all in one big bucket. And so they'll include it when they calculate everything for the parents. And then when they fill out the student side and it asks about student assets, they'll write the student assets in there again. So those assets get double counted. Those are the two biggest mistakes that get made. And then the resulting number is much higher than what people assume. They don't know what they don't know. They send it in.
So kind of on the line of assets, there's a good question in here about 529 plans. And does 529, or it says, does 529 fund count if not owned by a parent?
Somebody's been reading up from some good writers. So this is another big change. It used to be that if the student was a beneficiary of a 529, doesn't matter who owned it, you report it. And it gets counted in the assessment, in the formula that produces the SAI. It doesn't get assessed at the same degree as money that's in a savings account. So having a 529 versus just having college money in a savings account, much smarter to have it in a 529. But it used to be that it didn't matter who owned it. If the student is the beneficiary, you put it in. Now the rule is if anybody outside the immediate family owns that 529, it's not in the mix at all. So grandparents owning a 529 with the student as a beneficiary, that doesn't get mentioned in the FAFSA at all. And I got this question last week. So how do you set it up when the parent is thinking, well, I'm going to pass away soon, and I don't want that 529 money to now all of a sudden end up affecting the family's FAFSA, so the student's FAFSA. So one thing that can be done is that the grandparent can just say, well, I will pass the ownership of those 529s on a sort of to uncles and aunts. So, for example, if I had a brother, which I do, I shouldn't say it like that. I know he's not watching, so it doesn't matter. He's got some kids, so then I would be the owner of the 529 for his kids, and then he would be the owner of the 529 for my kids. So we keep the ownership of the 529 out of the immediate family. And as long as you do that, then it doesn't count at all.
So much information. How are you doing, everybody? Are you soaking up all of this information? I feel like it's just great information, and we're tackling a lot of your questions. I think we have time for maybe about 2 or 3 more, because we do want to leave you with some resources here at the end. And hopefully I'm scanning them and trying to condense what I can and ask as many as I can. So Mark, can you speak to the SAI can be a negative number, correct?
Yes. The SAI can now be a negative number. It can go down to negative 1,500. The theory, the thinking behind that was really pretty straightforward. That it used to be that a college would see that a student had a 0 EFC. Okay, so they get the Pell Grant, they get whatever other grants come from the state. But the college would basically say, all right, so if they've got need-based aid coming from other places, we'll throw in some little bit of need-based money, we get to 0, everybody's happy. But for many students, that 0 is actually an inflated reflection of what that student actually has to pay for college. Because remember, paying for college isn't just tuition fees, room and board. It's books, it's insurance. I don't know about you, but when I went to college, there was a phone on a wall with a cord hanging down from it, right? All those phones are gone, and schools expect every student to have a cell phone, right? So the student's got to pay for that. All of these other expenses, right, contribute to whether you can just afford to go to college. And so for a lot of students with a 0 EFC, that doesn't actually reflect the degree to which they have need. And so the negative number was intended to make sure that it communicated more clearly to the colleges in particular. 0 isn't just going to cut it for this student. -1,000, -1,200, 1,500, that's a more accurate reflection of the student's actual need.
Someone put the dorm phone in the chat there.
I can't tell
So,
him how many times mine got caught in the door.
yeah.
Oh,
So there was a question about, so the new FAFSA may help more students become eligible for Pell Grants, but there's no change to the federal loans that they're offered, correct? Meaning like the maximum amount for like a first year undergraduate dependent student, still $5,500. That's all the same.
yeah, the student loan money going out is the same. They have redone pretty significantly the repayment programs, the repay program. And that's probably a conversation for a whole nother session. But yes, in terms of the student loans, the amounts, the interest rates are changing as they always do. The subsidized concept, the unsubsidized concept, whether your loans are earning interest or accruing interest while you're in college would be unsubsidized. If they're not accruing interest while you're in college, that's subsidized. That's a little difference based on financial situation. All that stays the same.
Perfect. So there is a question, and I think it's on here twice, and I'm sorry if I missed it. It seems to be upvoted near the top. So if a parent did not file taxes, they will not be able to complete the FAFSA and the student misses out. I'll just read you the question. I know you're shaking your head.
Yeah.
Will the student be penalized if the parent has not filed taxes? So can you clarify on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked it. There are a whole slew of people who just don't have to file taxes because they don't make enough money to have to file taxes. And so that's just part of the system. Any family who meets that criteria, that's an automatic Pell Grant. Now it's different if somebody's been avoiding the law and just not filing because they chose not to, and they're moving from Wild West town to Wild West town. That's a different story. But if you're a family that hasn't filed taxes simply because you don't make enough money to file taxes, that's a simple one. That was one of the things that they did with this new FAFSA to make it simpler for people who clearly are going to qualify. So now it's just an automatic. You didn't file taxes, you got a W-2, maybe you don't. We've got all kinds of information about you in other parts of the federal government system. We know you're a low-income automatic Pell Grant.
So what happens if, and this is a question here on the board, if a student or a parent doesn't have a social security number?
Still okay. And this is another tweak that really is a great tweak. Again, the goal of the FAFSA this time was to get people through the whole thing. Don't have all these barriers in the front of the form that make it so they don't even ever fill the thing out. So if a student has parents that don't have a social security number, they might have an ITIN number, a tax number. They can plug that in instead. If they don't have any of that, they can just leave that whole thing blank and just continue through. They may have to invite the parent as a contributor. That's still fine. And the law is very clear that none of this documentation in the FAFSA ever gets sent over to Homeland Security or anything to deal with immigration. So people don't have to, worry, well, if I don't put information in, is it going to flip some flags and make, make a real mess for my family? No, you don't have to worry about that. If you don't have a social security number, the family can still get through the process and get a completed FAFSA in there.
Perfect. I think that answers the question that just popped up about, will it let you go through? The old one didn't let you.
Yes, right. And that was a huge problem in the old FAFSA, was you couldn't fill out one part, you were stuck. They've changed that. I mean, that was a big part of reducing the number of questions and making it so that there's anybody who's outside the norm, right, who doesn't have the information to fill out, that gets addressed after their FAFSA is completed, after it gets to the college, and the college is a financial aid officer that can work through those details. After the students applied, after they've already, let's solve those problems where in the space where it should be solved at the timing of it.
You said like reducing the number of questions. So the old FAFSA, to my knowledge, had over 100 questions.
108.
What's the new, like the redesigned FAFSA is about
36 questions. One question that just popped up in the chat, really important to clarify: undocumented students, can they qualify for federal aid? No. Undocumented students are still in the same boat that they've always been in, unfortunately. It doesn't mean, though, that the undocumented student can't qualify for state-based aid. And there are many states that have an alternative FAFSA. Sometimes they just call it that outright. That's the form that they can fill out. If they're undocumented, they wouldn't qualify. So I know Illinois does, Texas does, a bunch of states do.
Perfect. All right. I think, what do we got? 5 minutes left. We got a lot of information in this 1 hour session. So are they planning to release future FAFSAs in October like they used to, or
yes,
after this transition year?
Yeah, after this gentle transition year.
Yes. All right, everybody. So let me just scan here. I think we addressed most of the questions that are on the collab board, but I do know that we're going to put together a resource document to send you in the follow-up email that just has some additional resources. Mark, you kind of mentioned them already in the session, but if you were to share some helpful resources to the group here right now, as this is unfolding and it's coming and we're all kind of waiting for the release, what are some a quick couple that you would recommend? Quick
meaning both to gather information quickly and to go find it quickly. Go to the YouTube channel, Federal Student Aid. I'm like blown away. Instead of long droning webinars, they got these little 2-minute videos that are animated, and somebody named Taylor is just working their way, and like, it's super cool. And okay, maybe it's a little, I'm over the top a little bit, but they're just so much better. Little 2-minute FAQs, like, it's great. So those are wonderful little videos to get out there for people. Then if you really want to go deep, the Better FAFSA, which is the site hosted by the National College Attainment Network, NCAN, they have aggregated together all the stuff from the Department of Education, a bunch of stuff from you Aspire, a bunch of stuff from a couple of other organizations, all in one place. Some of them are webinars, some of them are PDFs, some of them are sort of, what do they call those, pathway documents where you can kind of see if this, then that. There's just a ton of stuff there, and it's worth taking 10 minutes to just sort of swim down that one, to just see what's there, because you're gonna find a boatload of tools that will be really helpful for the students and families. Yes, and it was asked in the chat if we'll send the links out to these resources that you're mentioning. Yes, we will. In the follow-up email, we'll put together a little document of resources, and I can attest to the YouTube channel's great. It's great for you to use in the classroom with your students. Totally. There's little mini videos. What is a contributor? A little 1-minute video that will talk about that. What do I need to prepare to complete the 24-25 FAFSA? They'll talk about that. So yep. I agree. Great little resource. And they're constantly kind of updating and releasing new videos, it seems, as we're progressing through this
this time frame. So yes, we will send you an follow-up with all of these resources, as I mentioned. And I do want to just kind of save the date coming in the new year, coming in 2024. Mark's going to host 3 different sessions. Mark, do you want to briefly kind of talk about these sessions just as a little like plug? Very briefly, you can.
It's useful to know, it really is. How did college pricing get to be what it is? How did this crazy ecosystem become what it is? And how does that compare with what we actually know about success? And when you take that story and you sort of pull it apart, first of all, it's a fabulously interesting little story, even though I'll be the one telling it. So I'm trying not to oversell it. But it's a really interesting story, and it's really useful to understand because it can help explain to people, how did things get to be the way they are? And how is it that students can then make sense of this, and parents can make sense of this and sort of fight the madness? Because this college admissions thing, the mental health effect of it is just awful. I mean, the effect on families, the effect on students, and on school counselors. I mean, it's just nuts. So this series is really intended to help people really understand how this system, how the dysfunctional dystopia works, and then peeling that back to be able to provide, I think, much more sane and helpful, useful information to students so that they know what they're walking into, to parents when they squawk. And frankly, you guys can help your school counselors, I think, a lot, provide better guidance to their families.
Yeah.